I finally had the time to be working on a new Sims 4 custom content hairstyle, and I was so excited. Hi, I'm Bella Sims, and I bring to you today another time lapse and talk through video of the creation of a new hairstyle. First off, I will say that while this piece was commissioned, it's already been released and is available to download from my Tumblr page, which is where I post all of my content since the beginning of time, and there will be a link below if you are interested in downloading it. I should also preface this by saying that the video isn't a tutorial. I won't be going step by step through the process on how to recreate what I've made. I will, however, talk about my methods, some things to keep in mind, some of the things that I've learned, and some things that maybe I should have done better and to keep in mind for next time. I still think it's something that you may learn something from, especially if you already have a basic knowledge of 3D modeling and custom content. Also, I'll be honest, this will probably end up being a bit of a long video, regardless of it being sped up. This is about 13 hours of work over the course of 6 or 7 days, condensed down into a time lapse. One more quick thing that I want to mention before I begin as well is that I have been setting up a new archives channel to post my Twitch streaming content on so that it doesn't clog up this channel too much. So over the course of the next few weeks, I'll be moving videos from here to over there, and it's also why I haven't been posting any of my recent VODs. But I am still streaming over on Twitch if you want to catch me live. It may just be a little bit before I get caught up to be posting the newest VODs over on that channel. Now, on to what this video is all about. This person provided a sketch of what they wanted their hair to look like, and it was actually a pretty decent start. It showed how the front and the back of their hair looked, which was enough for me to fill in the gaps. A lot of people have said that it reminds them of different characters, especially Tifa from Final Fantasy VII, that and the soon-to-die or the widowed anime mom. Regardless, it wasn't based on anything specific other than the image that I was provided with. Whether that person got inspiration from these sources, I don't know. I started out with what's called a blockout stage, where I use larger mesh shapes to block out the rough shape that the hair will form and gives me a good foundation to work from. I decided to do this by just using a basic plane with subdivision modifier to smooth it out with more detail and a solidify modifier to give it some thickness. People ask me why I do this method rather than curves, and it's just because this is what works for me, and specifically with this hairstyle as it was pulled back into a hair tie, I saw that being easier to block out this way. I follow the rough guide that I drew onto the head to separate the pieces and where the part will sit. Once I have the bulk of the hair down, I can go in and add some smaller details. I don't really know how to explain them, but like the thickish strands on the very left of the hair, screen left but on the model's right, and just adds a bit of detail to it so that it doesn't look like a big blob of clay. And lastly, I do use curves to add in some thinner strands and mess with the properties a bit so that they aren't just basic cylinders but instead have a flat shape to them, and also taper towards the end of the strand. Max's match hair is often referred to as clay-like hair because it features the thicker sections of the hair shape and not individual strands of hair. I try to go for this for the main shape, but with a little bit more detail in the form of the extra strands. I at least start off by referencing the original image without directly tracing it, so that way I'm not too hung up on all the details and specific proportions. But when it starts to look not quite right, I overlay the image and adjust it close to what it should be. After I've got a rough block out, I take each of the main sections and refine them and add definition with sculpt mode. Here I'm working on creating creases between the different sections and creating thick sections of hair. I don't want anything to be so marshmallowy and puffy, so I use a flattened brush to give the sections a bit more shape. This process takes a little while, but this will form the foundation for what the hair actually looks like in the end, so it's good to take your time to get it looking right. It is at this point, after I've got a lot of the sculpting detail in, that I check in with the client for progress. I don't want to go too far if there's something that they want changed or fixed up, but I felt this was a good point to show how the hair would look. Everything was all good, so I just keep on working. Now, I thought I did a pretty good job at waffling on to fill in a lot of the time that it takes to do this tedious kind of work, but apparently not. For those that want to watch the full process, maybe learn something about my methods, I don't know, but please continue. Otherwise, for those that would like to skip ahead like a minute and a half to hear me talk again, you're also welcome to do that.
Nowhere to go.
Now that that's all done, I can do what's called retopology, because I don't want this super high detail sculpted mesh to be my actual mesh to use in game. It's way too much detail for what we need, and it would be absolute hell to unwrap, and just be very poorly optimized in general. Not to mention, it's still in a lot of separate parts. So retopology is the process of creating a new mesh over the top of this one, so that way we can keep the shape and all the detail we just made, but in a much lower poly mesh. For reference, the sculpted mesh has over 270,000 vertices, whereas the final retopology has about 3,914. My method is to start out with a plane as a new object, then move that onto the surface of the sculpted object using face snapping, and then also apply a shrink wrap modifier. These two combined give me a nice result that clings to the surface. I extrude this face along the surface of the mesh, making sure to follow important details like the creases that I added in earlier. This is a bit tedious. I tend to just zone out and watch YouTube videos or live stream while I work on getting the entire mesh covered. I know there's other methods of doing this, like using the B-Surfaces add-on or whatever it's called. It didn't work out too well for me, but I may also have been doing it wrong. While I was messing around with it and trying to get it to work and figure out what I was doing, I could have had a decent portion of it already retopologized in my own method, so I just went back to doing that. On that note though, like I mentioned, I still have the sculpted mesh in large individual pieces, but with the retopology version, I make it all as one mesh, so it's all one piece. The smaller individual strands and flyaway hairs that I add in that are very thin and just for added detail, I leave them separate from the retopology. I can easily just modify the properties of the curve to have less detail in them before converting them to a mesh. I think I remove a little bit of detail from some of the small strands where it wasn't really needed, but otherwise I just keep them as is. With the underneath part of the hair, I only retopologize up to where the hair touches the skin, and in the end I'm left with a circle-ish shaped hole where the head intersects. After I'm happy with the retopology, I can go ahead and apply that shrink wrap modifier so it's no longer confined to the sculpted mesh, then extrude and merge this ring to the middle. And I just learned this by looking at how EA makes their hair meshes, and it's pretty much the same thing. Again, the retopology is another process that is a bit tedious and time consuming, but I wanted to show the full process for anyone who was curious to see it start to finish, but also to show just how much time goes into creating content like this. But if you'd like to skip ahead to the 12.5 minute mark until I'm talking again, I completely understand. After applying my modifiers, there were some bits here and there that weren't quite sitting right or weren't quite smooth, so I just fixed them up as needed. I left the ends of all the strands open earlier so that I could go in now and make them all nice and pointy. At this point, what I'm doing is going through and removing some detail that I don't need. See, I also had a subdivision modifier on the Retopology that I was doing so that I got a smoother result, but it means there's added detail all over the mesh, including where I don't need it. For example, underneath the hair doesn't need that much detail, and just wherever I see a lot of edge loops, I'll see if I can get away with dissolving any of them without losing any detail that would be noticeable. Mainly just trying to get the poly count down a little bit and make the density a little bit more even all over. This isn't anything too special, basically just going around and either editing individual vertices back into place, or I also use the smooth brush in sculpt mode to smoothen it out a bit. Specifically as well, for the underside of the hair, I don't need to add in as much detail as most of this is going to be covered by the Sin's body anyway, and I can get away with most of the detail being in the texture instead. Also, for the areas of the hair that are straighter, I don't need as much detail as it won't be noticeable compared to where the mesh is curved, and I do need those extra edges. Now that I've got a nice clean mesh to work with, unwrapping is pretty easy. Well, easy compared to what it could have been. I am quite a visual person, so I do find it easy to see how these 3D shapes should be cut and separated into 2D shapes, but I understand how some people would find it more difficult. I'm mainly just following the creases in the hair and making seams to separate it out, kind of like into the sections that I started with in the very beginning. I ended up with mainly long thin strips that I modify on the 2D UV to be a bit more nice and straight, as the texture I'm using as a base is also straight. I really should keep more order to my UV maps, like keeping the front left fringe together, the back left hair, the front right fringe, the back left hair, etc. Just keep thinking them together as groups, but also so that the top and the bottom of each hairpiece lines up the same way, so that it's easier for anyone to recolor if they wanted to do like a split dye or an ombre. It's not impossible for anyone to do that, even with the UV that I've made, but it would just be a bit more tedious and would involve dissecting the 3D mesh just to see what part is what. Another thing to note about my process is that I find it easier to keep track of unwrapping by selecting parts and hiding the sections that are done. I just go into face mode, select with L, and change the criteria to seam, then it's easy to see if you've missed a seam and it's still connected to the rest of the hair. And by hiding it, when I've isolated it and no longer need to worry about it at this stage, it's easy to see what I have left to do. Out of sight, out of mind. The texture that I use as a template is just from one of EA's straight hair meshes, and I use the greyish purplish colour. The colour that I use is actually very specific, as I have some Photoshop gradient actions set up specifically for this base colour and to then generate the other 23 hair swatches. As you can see, the texture on the hair as is does not look that great, so I end up repainting over pretty much everywhere to match it to my new hairstyle. I'm trying to match the original swatch as close as possible, with the same shade for the shadows and the midtones and the highlights. But I just go around each individual section to fix it up however I need to, and then move on to the next section, and then make sure that each section in the end blends seamlessly. The hairstyle also has a basic black hair tie, but in the final package there's an option to change the color, and I'll get to that a bit more later. I actually don't have much more to say about this process. It's a little tedious, again, to go over every individual piece, but the end result is much more worth it in the end, I think. One helpful thing that I have recently discovered in Blender, and I use it quite often since, is that while Blender doesn't handle layers with the texture paint in the sense that, like in Photoshop, how you could shade on a new layer and set the blending mode to multiply, or do a separate highlight layer and set that to overlay, you can actually change the blending mode of the brush itself as you're painting. So this can come in handy when I needed to darken some areas and lighten others for higher contrast. But I'm going to be at this stage for a little while longer. You know the drill. we move over to an older version of Blender to construct our file. For the weight painting, I transferred the weights from another hand mesh as a base, but because this is a long hairstyle, I import and look at the weights for the standard body mesh. I ended up just painting over the lower half manually so that it follows the neck and the spine, and there's also that small strand that sits over the chest, so I need to fix that up as well so that it moves with the body properly. I also transfer over the morph map, aka the UV1, from the basic torso mesh and do my vertex paint. There's also the hat chops, but it seems that I didn't record that bit. I do them after my LODs, but I basically just select the mesh in edit mode and then use the bisect tool to cut along the EA hat chops as a guide. I remove what I don't want and then just clean up the edges. Moving over to Photoshop now. As I said earlier, I have gradient actions to recolor this specific purple grey swatch into all of the other colors. I say that, but this is the project that I made the gradients myself. So it did take a little bit longer because I didn't already have them set up previously. I just add in a gradient map and then color pick from each EA swatch to remap the shadows and highlights and such into the new color. As a general rule, for most swatches, I was able to color pick the darkest shadow color, a mid-dark color, a mid-light color, and then the brightest highlight color. Though for some of the swatches, especially the brights like the pink and the green and the blue, I had to pick some extra colors here and there to make it match up as perfectly as I could. I didn't record all of this because it's literally just the same process repeated 23 times, because EA now has a palette of 24 hair swatches. But at least I can save these gradients for future use and it will be a bit quicker next time and I don't have to start from scratch. The last thing on my to-do list is the lower LODs or level of detail. I find this easiest to have the UV pinned on the other screen so that I can see if anything goes wrong as I work, but also applying the texture to the model as well. If any warping happens, I can see it straight away. I'm strategically selecting edge loops, usually about every second one depending on how much detail it removes, and dissolving them. Then for the next LOD, I remove even more detail, and then the last detail, I just go wild and reduce it down as much as possible, but not to the point where it's destroying the shape and not recognizable anymore. These levels of detail are something that you shouldn't actually notice in-game, but what happens is when you look at your sim closely or in Create a Sim mode, the LOD 0 model is used, and that's the highest detail model. Then, as you zoom out to a certain distance away, the game unloads that model and replaces it with the LOD 1, which is a step lower in detail. Then, further away, it will switch out to the LOD 2 and then the LOD 3. This makes sense so that the more you zoom out and the more objects you're rendering on the screen, the less detail is in all of those objects. Depending on the object, some will have 4 separate levels of detail, some will only have 3, and some may only have 2, I think, in the case of earrings. This is also why, if you've ever downloaded custom content that changes mesh or disappears entirely when you zoom out, is because the creator didn't make their lower levels of detail properly, or at all. Now, I promise the video is wrapping up very soon. I only have like a minute left if I'm honest. As some final notes, I do take suggestions for content if it's something that I am excited to make, but I make no guarantees that I will actually make it. At the moment, I am working on Pride custom content for June, so I'm a bit more open to suggestions for that, but the best way to guarantee for me to make something is through commissions, like this piece. While it isn't something that I probably would have made myself, it has turned out to be my favourite hair so far. And on that note, I do have commission info on Tumblr, including starting prices, as I want to try and be as transparent about it as possible and not beat around the bush. Now that the video is wrapped up, here's the final result in all of the EA shades. It is available for both feminine and masculine frames for teen to elder sims. As I mentioned earlier, there's also an overlay accessory that you can find in the brow ring accessory section, which matches all of the hair colors if you'd like a subtle matching look, or you can mix and match. I hope you enjoyed the video, hope you enjoyed the content, and thanks for watching.